Good evening. Good evening. Welcome again to our third week of Theology on Tap. I'd like to give a warm welcome, especially to anybody who is new, anybody who's coming again for the third time. If you come 4 times the last week, you get a free beverage. Just kidding. No, it's still on you. I'd like to begin with a question. What do Waco, Albuquerque, Lubbock, Charlottesville, College Station all have in common? Austin, Texas also. Yeah, so those are all places where our speaker, Rob Reed, has lived, studied, worked. He is the common denominator. He brings all those places together. He has a fascinating background, a graduate of Waco High School, where Lion Pride runs deep. There you go. Current faculty member at Waco High back there. He parlayed a job as a security guard at Baylor University into an undergraduate degree from Baylor University. He got his MA in philosophy at Texas Tech, began his doctoral work in Charlottesville. He decided that city was just too beautiful, and so he then finished his doctoral work at the University of, at Texas A&M, where he taught logic and engineering ethics. And then one day, he got a phone call and said, would you like to work on a decades-long artificial intelligence research project that I imagine taking place in a building that looks like what we saw in Stranger Things, sort of an underground, this was a DARPA-funded deal. After leaving that project, returned to Baylor. You always come back home. And he has been a lecturer in the philosophy department there, where he teaches ethics and AI, moral philosophy, and East Asian philosophy. His research is centered around the concept of virtue and its implications for the Christian faith, political life, and technology. And based on that, I would say never play Trivial Pursuit with this guy. He will wipe the floor with you. He has 4 children. He attends Christ Church Waco, although when he was here, he grew up going to First Baptist Waco. So like many of you, he has a diverse background, ecclesiologically speaking. And his wife, Tiffany, would like you to know that she is not from Waco. She is visiting family right now on the East Coast. But with no further ado, I give you Rob Reed.
Okay, can you hear me? Hear me, okay. All right, I'm going to pull this back. Oh. I think we can make that work. Is it that one? So, Andrew approached me about doing this talk in the fall, and we had some good conversations, and I was a little bit tardy in getting back to him with a title. So he was good enough to give me a title for the talk. Artificial Intelligence is Artificial. And I think by the time we get to, if you have the handout, let's see. Yeah, Roman numeral 3. I think we'll be able to understand exactly what Andrew meant. Okay. So the way we should approach this is through questions. This is a query-driven talk. So with each Arabic numeral, you're going to see a question that I hope you're able to answer or at least think about deeply at the end of this talk. Okay, so pay attention to the questions. And we can just start with the ethics of technology itself. Is there a distinctive subject matter for the ethics of technology? When I first showed up at Texas A&M, I was a little bit skeptical about whether or not there was anything that could be properly called ethics of technology. What I mean is, you have to use math when you're shopping at H-E-B. You have to use math when you're balancing your checkbook. But there isn't like a separate math of H-E-B. and a separate math of your checkbook and a separate math of balancing a federal budget, I think. They're all just different applications of the same thing, right? There's one arithmetic, many applications. And it was very difficult for me to see how there's anything distinctive with technology. Isn't this just another application of some fundamental moral principles that you could apply anywhere? Well, I taught engineering ethics for a few years and came to think that, in fact, there is something distinctive to the ethics of technology. And the best way to see what it is to do a little bit of ethics of technology. So that's what we're going to do. And the way I've organized this is I'm going to introduce you to two thinkers from the middle of the 20th century who gave us two warnings about technology, Heidegger and C.S. Lewis. And then I'm going to examine two complaints, one of them in depth, the other we may not have time to go in too much. Two complaints about artificial intelligence, and hopefully we can see how these complaints show that the warning that Heidegger and C.S. Lewis gave us was a serious warning. Okay, so let's start by asking the question, is technology value-free? Okay, when I showed up at Texas A&M, it seemed to me the answer was obviously yes. Okay, technology is just a neutral tool. Okay, you can use the technology for good purposes, you can use it for bad purposes. And whether or not it's good or bad just depends on the purpose that you assign to it. Okay? And in this respect, nuclear energy is kind of the paradigm case. People will say, look, there's all kinds of positive uses that nuclear energy can be put towards. It can be used to create plentiful, reliable electricity. There's all kinds of interesting imaging technologies that can be used in medicine. There's actually even radioactive medicine. But it can also be used destructively. It can be used for weapons. And so whether or not nuclear energy is good or bad really just depends on the use you put it to. And that does seem like a strong case for the neutrality of technology. And another mid-20th century thinker, Robert Welchel, says, we're really asking the wrong question. We shouldn't be focusing only on the particular artifacts that come out as the end products. We need to be thinking about the very large systems that make research, advancement, production, and marketing of new technology possible. We need to think about the social world, the economic conditions, the organizations and the organizational culture that goes into producing technology. And he thinks if we start to look there, what we find is that in order to contribute meaningfully in the research and production of new technology, you have to operate on certain values, okay? So these, you might call these the functional values of technology. And he's kind of building off of Heidegger. And he identifies objectivity, quantification, efficiency, and utility as the values of technology. And let me give you an example. Let me give you a little analogy. I think it would be perfectly possible to have private political moral opinions that might make someone a Marxist, and yet they could function working for any major bank in the country, okay? Those could be your private values, but if you're a loan officer or you're in any kind of serious position in a bank, you are going to have to learn how to see the world in a certain way to make the kinds of decisions that will result in your bank succeeding. And so even if those don't reflect your private values, to function well in a bank, you will be operating on a certain evaluative perspective of the world. We could call those the values of banking. What Welchel is saying is that in engineering, these are the values that the engineer has to operate on if they're to meaningfully contribute. to research and advancement of technology. Okay? So what are the dangers? Well, a German philosopher named Martin Heidegger gives us this question. How does technology shape our understanding of the world? And here he means technology as this value system, okay, as a system, okay? And in his 1949 lectures, The Question Concerning Technology, he gives us two ideas that I want us to unpack. One is called inframing. I think that they should be listed on your handout. Inframing, and the other is standing reserve. And I'll just try to really quickly tell you what he means by these, okay? So, a great example, a great analogy of what inframing is a really well thought out photograph that someone takes that brings an object into focus, but by definition, because of the limitations of the frame, excludes other things. And Heidegger thinks that the engineer or the practicing, I think he calls them technologists, when they are working in their capacity to research and advance technology, they have to take on a perspective that kind of excludes really important fundamental aspects of reality to focus on the values of technology. And those are on your first page. They are objectivity, utility, quantification, and efficiency. And Heidegger thinks when we get habituated into looking at the world through the lens of these values, the world takes on a certain character. He says it appears to us as what he calls standing reserve. And what that means is we don't see objects for what they are. We see them in terms of the functions that we can assign to them. We see them insofar as they can be useful for some economic venture. Okay, that is, we learn to see the world as commodities. Okay, waiting to be harvested. And so you look at the forest and you don't necessarily see trees or an ecosystem. You see so many tons of wood. Okay, and notice how we bring that quantification to bear. We measure the world in terms of the commodities that we can turn it into. Okay? Heidegger doesn't think that this inframing is wrong or incorrect. He thinks it's correct. He just thinks it's not complete. Okay? There's more to the reality of the world than what we see under inframing. And the danger is when we mistake the limited perspective, the inframing perspective, for the complete reality. If we do that, then we run the risk of distorting the world. And just kind of think of this as the problem. Do you guys know the myth of Procrustes' bed? This is like in Greek mythology. This guy Procrustes, he wasn't a great Airbnb host, but he said he had a bed that fit anybody. Anyone fits in my bed. And of course, what would happen is, when the guest is sleeping, Procrustes would sneak in, and if they were too tall, he would cut their legs off. And if they were, I don't know what it means to be too short for a bed, but whatever that, he would stretch them out so they fit it. And I think that's the danger that Heidegger thinks comes from inframing. If we think that value system that we have to operate on when we're advancing technology, if we're not careful, we're going to mistake that for the total reality, and it will not remain in engineering. It will actually seep out into the broader culture. Okay? Now, what does Heidegger know? He's an old Nazi, and perhaps even more offensive to analytic philosophers, he wasn't a clear writer. Okay? So in the philosophy I do, analytic philosophy, not many people read Heidegger. Okay? So maybe we should look elsewhere. I think Father Aaron mentioned I grew up at First Baptist Waco. Baptists, we have no creeds, we have no confessions, and you may think that means we have no magisterium. But C.S. Lewis is the adopted doctor of the church, okay? So let's see what C.S. Lewis has to say about this. And here I think the question, we can kind of do a slight adjustment to Heidegger's question. Ask, does technological advancement have a natural endpoint or limit? Okay, and you'll understand what I mean here in a minute. But Lewis is thinking very similarly to Heidegger, and I did not notice this until I was preparing for this talk. But C.S. Lewis got there first. The Abolition of Man lectures are 1943, so it seems like he was thinking about this before, or put it out before Heidegger. If you read the last lecture in the book, The Abolition of Man, you'll hear C.S. Lewis talk about magic. Okay, what does he mean by magic? And the way Lewis defines it, magic is a stance or a posture towards the world where instead of conforming ourselves to the world, we learn to conform the world to our desires. That is, instead of practicing soulcraft, instead of pruning, cultivating desires, we learn to instantaneously satisfy them through ever more complex and efficient technology. Okay? And normally what would happen in a world without advanced technology is that to get the things that you need, or for your community to get the things that it needs from the world, it requires that we, in various practices and crafts, take on some kind of discipline, okay? And in this discipline, we have to attentively engage with the world and acquire skill in dealing with the world, okay? And in this process, we develop greater knowledge of the world as it is, and at the same time, we actually have to subordinate our desires to the order of this discipline. In other words, you have to build character in the process. And there are some fascinating writings we have from the early 20th century when, for example, a lot of carpentry and woodworking transitioned from being a craft to being fully industrialized. And so the days of the carpenter wandering through the forest, looking for just the right tree, understanding that trees, of a certain age or near a certain river were especially good for certain purposes, that's all over and done with. You just get the wood, you shove it through the mechanical saw, and you're done. Okay? And maybe that still counts as progress. But what Lewis is interested in is the cumulative effect of losing these opportunities to develop character through skillful engagement with the world. Okay? So Lewis will equate our technology with magic. Okay? He says, our technology is just the magic that won out, the magic that worked. And then he introduces this idea of the magician's bargain. And here the idea is that the way we gain power, the way our technology advances, is we make a sacrifice to nature. That's the magician's bargain. You sacrifice part of the world to nature, and in return, science gives you power. What does that mean? You have to understand what he meant by nature here. When C.S. Lewis says nature in this context, he means a very new scientific way of conceiving of the world in terms of quantifiable matter, atoms, and essentially disenchanting the world from the way that it was understood before. So if we're thinking about when this shift happens, we're talking the 1600s and the rise of modern science. If you're familiar with people like Francis Bacon or Rene Descartes, these would be the figures who kind of inaugurate this new way of conceiving of the world. We're at St. Alban. I trust there are doctors out here. If I was to throw a glass, how many doctors would I get wet?
Maybe 4 or 5.
Okay, all right, good, perfect. Okay. So maybe you've had this experience where someone you know, a loved one's in the hospital, and you're sitting there, maybe it's kind of serious. And when the doctor comes in, they don't initially go to the patient. They actually go and they look at all these charts, and they look at all these numbers and these graphs, and they already know what's going on inside the patient's body before they ever talk to the patient, okay? That would have been amazing to the physicians running around in the 1500s, okay? How did that happen? And the short answer is that there's a great book called The Devil's Doctor about Paracelsus. I encourage you to read it if you want a fun read. But the real transition comes with Descartes. And Descartes had this idea that you can conceive of everything happening in the body in terms of numbers. And the type of medicine that's practiced today, I would say in that respect, is Cartesian medicine. Okay, the doctor, do you guys know what a P wave is or S wave? Yeah. Everything happening inside you can now be represented in numbers. That's what Lewis means by a sacrifice to nature. Okay? Which means there are no Platonic forms. There are no Aristotelian substances. There are no qualities at all. If it can't be quantified, it's not real. Okay? And Lewis thinks the vision of the world that emerges after we make the sacrifice to nature is a world where there is no intrinsic telos or goodness. The only value the world has is that we impose upon it when we assign it for use for our purposes. And the term he uses is raw material. We learn to see the world as raw material. And that's exactly Heidegger's notion of standing reserve. Okay? So raw material, it has no intrinsic purpose, only what we assign to it. No intrinsic goodness or value, only how it satisfies our desires. And it doesn't even have integrity as being. It's just a heap of atoms to be rearranged in a way that serves our purposes. And ultimately what that means is when the sacrifice to nature has been made, there is no created world to understand, okay? We impose all the order. We do all the creating, and we're the ones who make the pronouncements of good, okay? So it's pretty serious. But here's the problem. Once we get rolling, it's very hard to stop. And almost every one of these thinkers thinks the story ends the exact same way. There's a final sacrifice. And the final sacrifice to nature is humanity itself. Okay? So we learn to reconceive of humanity as raw material with no intrinsic purpose or goodness, no integrity, only that which we impose on it from our desires. Okay, and I compare this to the myth of King Midas. Okay, so this is the guy, everything he touches turns to gold, which sounds great. That's amazing. But how does the story end? He turns his daughter into gold, and then he realizes he's done something horrible. Okay, this is C.S. Lewis's warning about the values of technology. Ultimately, we'll turn it on humanity itself. And we may think we want to make humanity a commodity, but if we actually succeeded, the results would be pretty terrible. Okay? So those are the two warnings from the beginnings of ethics of technology. Now let's talk about AI. That's what you guys are here for, right? We'll talk about AI. Okay. All right, so let me first talk about Erik Larson, and we'll probably, I hope we get to Williams. But these are two Texans, okay? Eric Larson he's based down in Bryan, just down the river, just down Highway 6. And James Williams, he's actually from Abilene originally, so I just wanted to mention that. There's a lot of good Texans out there. Larson and I, we both got our start at Psychor, working on the Psych project. We didn't overlap, but we had the same mentor, Doug Linnett. And so my perspective on AI and Larson's perspective, they're pretty similar, okay? And in the book, The Myth of Artificial Intelligence, Larson is going to say the artificial intelligence project has already failed, okay? It's probably not what you were expecting, okay? Not only has it failed, but its failure is deeply baked into the project towards the beginning. And the consequences of the failure are part of the reason why science itself has stalled out, and there haven't been any real meaningful theoretical breakthroughs in decades, okay? So, let's dig in a little deeper. What on earth is he talking about? The AI project has already failed. Okay, so here's the idea. When the AI project began, this was the goal. We're going to create an artificial intelligence that achieves the level of a human. That was the goal. So human level intelligence, if we can do that, we've achieved it. And there was this famous Dartmouth conference in the late 50s where some mathematicians got together and they said, hey, if we just get a couple guys over the summer, we can probably hammer this out in a few months, okay? That was the Dartmouth project. Turned out, and this was their thinking. They were mathematicians, and they were thinking mathematical reasoning, since that represents kind of the highest form of human intelligence. They thought since we have that licked, everything else should just kind of fall out. And it did not work anything remotely like that. Ultimately, what we figured out is that computers, no matter how much information you give them, they lack common sense. Good old human common sense. Okay, let me give you an example. Let me give you a question that any of you with access to Wikipedia could answer in 45 seconds, okay? How tall was the president the year Barack Obama was born? Okay? And until ChatGPT, and I'll come back to ChatGPT, until ChatGPT, almost none of them could answer this. Not Siri, not Alexa, not anything at MIT. We had a DARPA project at Psychor where for the government, we tested all the large language models, and none of them could answer questions like this. They would give you like the elevation of Hawaii or something. But it shouldn't be that hard. But what you have to do is what we would call an AI, you have to do transformations, okay? We have to transform this into other questions. What was the year Barack Obama was born? Who was the president that year? How tall was that president? Seems pretty easy. And eventually, I think it was Siri, they got so tired of Doug using this example in TED Talks, they hardwired the answer in. And then he just found another example. And then there's another type of question. We call these common sense tests. So this is what I did. I would design common sense tests in order to test AI. And these would be questions that any competent English speaker above the age of 8 should be able to answer. We'll see how smart you guys are. All right. So, Jim tried to fit the trophy into the suitcase, but it was too small. What was too small? All right, you guys are good. Better than most large language models. Jim was trying to fit the trophy into the suitcase, but it was too large. What was too large? The trophy. Okay. So that's called a Winograd question, and there's two forms of it. And if you're just looking at the syntax, okay, they're identical in form. And yet the referent of it changes based on whether or not you say too small or too big, okay? And you guys knew the answer because you had common sense. But you cannot imagine the misery it is to try to teach a computer to make that distinction, okay? So human natural language is something that AI has just not been able to do, not even ChatGPT, and I'll come to that in a second. But you might be wondering, like, wait, come on. Surely AI has made progress, right? Surely. There was a time when humans could be AI at checkers, right? And by the 80s, that was over, okay? There was a time that humans could beat AI at chess. And by the late 90s, that was over. There was a time humans could beat AI at Scrabble, okay? And then I think in 2011, AI could beat humans at Jeopardy. And so you might think, well, clearly that's progress. AI is getting more intelligent. Larson and I will tell you that's entirely an illusion. It's entirely an illusion. It turns out it doesn't require general intelligence to outperform humans at these games. It requires relatively simple algorithms, okay? And so it's not that we're doing something new or more advanced. What's happening is engineers are getting better and better at writing algorithms to master human games, okay? So the advancement of, if there's an advancement in intelligence, it's the engineers, okay? The AI, all it's doing is it's following an algorithm to learn from experience. That's all it's doing, okay? And if you want to really praise someone, think about how smart you have to be to take something like Scrabble and turn it into an algebra problem. Because that's what the computer's saying. It's saying an algebra problem, okay? It is not conceiving it the way you conceive of Scrabble. So a really, really, really smart engineer figured out how to turn Scrabble into algebra. That's where the advancement is, okay? But let me draw your attention to something else. All these examples where programs can outperform humans, they're all domain-specific programs, okay? Meaning if you train up an application to be really good at chess, it is going to be terrible at Scrabble, okay? It's only going to do one thing, okay? You guys ever hear people talk about parameters, like the ChatGPT parameters? Okay, let me tell you what that is. That's a fancy way of saying a coefficient in a really, 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 really long algebraic expression, okay? So if you hear, this chess engine uses 50 billion parameters, that means a really, really, really long algebra problem, okay? And every one of those parameters, this is the industry term, biases the machine to be good at chess. And so they impede its performance at anything else. So if you were to take a program that maybe was flexible enough to be trained up to do different games, and you trained it first on chess and made it pretty good, as soon as you started training it on something else, its performance on chess would come down, okay? And this is true of every application, even ChatGPT. It's all entirely domain specific, okay? That's not human general intelligence, okay? Let's talk about ChatGPT, which you guys are ready for. So as I've said, it's turning human language into a math problem. That's what it's doing. The latest GPT-4, I think, is 100 trillion parameters, okay? Now think about that. If you ask me a question about philosophy, I could probably give you a decent answer. I'm not solving a 100 trillion, And This just reminds me of something our dearly departed Doug used to say. He said, imagine memorizing 5 billion arithmetic problems instead of learning to add and subtract. Is that intelligence? Okay? And essentially that's what ChatGPT is doing, okay? ChatGPT is trained up on a petabyte. Does even know that there were petabytes? When I was a kid, there were megabytes. Then there's gigabytes, then there's terabytes, then petabytes. Okay. A gigabyte is a ton of text. That would get you roughly 200 million English words. Okay. And if you were to try to speak 200 million English words, I estimate it would take you about 2.5 years. Maybe 3 at the most, 2 at the minimum. Okay. I would guess if you go to your average 8-year-old child, they have not yet even heard a gigabyte of English. That would be my guess, okay? That would have to be nonstop parents talk. And if you have kids, you know they do the talking, okay? If they had trained ChatGPT on 1 gigabyte of text, it would be absolutely worthless. Absolutely worthless. We can talk more about, if you have questions, I can say more about how they train it. But even as good as it is, I have an exercise in my classes where one day we try to break ChatGPT. I'll just share with you some of my favorites, okay? One student asked ChatGPT last year, how many months have fewer than 32 days? How many? All of them. Yeah, ChatGPT said none. And you might think, why? Why? You could ask ChatGPT, how many months in the year are there? 12. How many days does February have? 28 or 20? You could ask it for each month. And you could ask it how many months there are. And it would never be able to put it together. All right? That should alert you that something's going on. It's never seen anyone talk about the number 32 and months in its training data. That's why. Okay? This might be my favorite. So if it takes 2 hours for 5 wet socks to dry on a clothesline, how long for 10 wet socks? Yeah. ChatGPT said 4 hours. Okay. And we had a lot of fun with this. We said, if it takes 4 trumpet players 5 minutes to play a march, how long would it take 8? And you can imagine. Okay, an 8-year-old child who doesn't have nearly a petabyte worth of experience is going to outperform on basic reasoning. And at this point, now I will say the newest you pay for does tend to do better on these kinds of questions. But if you work hard, you can still break it. Especially if you ask it to do any kind of math in the double or triple digits. If you start multiplying in double digits, you should be able to break it pretty easily. Okay? All right, so at the end of the day, let's see. Okay, well, why can't we admit the artificial intelligence project has failed? That's what Larson says. Why can't we admit it? And this is his answer. Because human intelligence is no longer the standard by which we evaluate machine intelligence. Okay? At some point, very quietly and very subtly, probably many decades ago, computer performance became the standard by which we evaluate human intelligence. Ooh. And so we already have come to see human brains as outdated, slow, unreliable wetware. Okay? Because computation is now our paradigm of intelligence. Okay? So who warned you about this? Heidegger. This is the Procrustean bed. It's a sacrifice to nature. Okay? The practice of computing technology habituated us into seeing human intelligence through a special computing and framing. And that blocked out aspects of human intelligence that don't neatly fit into a computing paradigm. Okay? Solving an algebra problem with 100 trillion coefficients to predict the most likely token. That's not human general intelligence, and it's not linguistic reasoning. Okay? And maybe even worse, Larson suggests, and I really do recommend the book. This paradigm has been brought into science. Okay? Do you guys remember the excitement and hype about swarm science or the hive mind? Okay. Well, great example. So machines can't do like real theorizing, and so we downplay the role of humans and even the role of theory in science. Machines are really good at well-defined mechanical tasks, and often kind of the gold standard in solving a problem with machines is to find a way to break a complex task into numerous other tasks that can be pursued in parallel, each which is kind of simple. And the hive mind people were like, great, this is how we should do science, okay? We should expect large groups of collaborative scientific projects to use human scientists as computers. That is, to make piecemeal cognitive contributions doing relatively simple tasks, okay? And so far, it's produced absolutely nothing, all right? Let me finish on Williams, but please read the book to learn about, this is Larson's complaint. We've lost our ability to appreciate human intelligence, and now we're diminishing our expectations for humans, and science is suffering because of it. We're not seeing the kind of innovations or theoretical breakthroughs we should be seeing, okay? And a key part of this is it's very hard if you're investing billions of dollars to predict who the next Einstein is going to be. It's much easier to get a big team of collaborative scientists and kind of churn the pot slowly. And then you're guaranteed to get some return, but you're not going to get the big breakthroughs, okay? All right, let me finish on Williams. Okay, how does AI actually make money? Do you guys know how many trillion-dollar companies there are? There's only a few. And let me draw your attention. There's Apple, there's Amazon, but let me draw your attention to Meta. I think we had someone from Meta here. And Google. How much did you pay for your Gmail? How much did you pay for your Facebook account? Okay. If you did not pay for the product, you are the product. Okay? Facebook and Google are advertising companies. They're not tech companies. They're advertising companies. And one thing that we see in business is when a new commodity is unlocked, we see all this investment behavior that converges on that commodity and tries to get a monopoly on it. This is how big oil arose. It's how Detroit became the auto center. And this is what has made Google and Meta trillion-dollar companies. And the commodity that they are harvesting, the commodity that they are extracting, is human attention. Okay? So you are the commodity at this point. And I'll close with this observation. Your attention is valuable to you in a way that it is not valuable to corporations. All the components of a good life, a flourishing life, the various projects, the various commitments require your rational direction of your own attention. And if we have sophisticated AI consistently hijacking your attention, that's adversarial technology, okay? And the way that your attention and your rational faculties are being viewed by these companies is as a commodity to harvest, okay? And so hopefully, I think we're we're now in a position to answer the question, is there a subject matter for the ethics of technology? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate this. And so I want you to write down some questions that you have for Dr. Reed, and we'll get started with your questions. I have one that sort of tails on what you were just talking about. What would happen if the mentality you were just describing made its way into education? Wouldn't that be a bad thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be terrifying.
Yeah.
I think what we want from education is we want people to develop their rational capacities to their full completion. We don't want them to be commodified as merely like a tool for making money. And yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if maybe it's already crept into education a little.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. All right, I'm going to sit. Do you want to have a seat?
Yeah, we can do that.
And with this background, it sort of looks like we're doing an 80s comedy club thing.
That's right.
And what's the deal with AI? Am I right? Is this thing it? Okay. Let's see here. How would you rename the functions that we now call AI? We have certain expectations based on this label of artificial intelligence. So what would be a better way of naming this technology?
Yeah, so at the Dartmouth conference, this was a question that they considered. And I believe it was Marvin Minsky who came up with artificial intelligence. But the other option was complex information processing. And they decided that didn't have the same ring to it. But yeah, I think that is what it is, complex information processing. It's a very useful tool.
Is there any possibility within the next generation of quantum computing somehow changing the paradigm that we're talking about?
Let me answer what I think that's asking. That will get us more speed, okay? And so that more speed, that does change things. But I think what that will do is that will enable engineers to transform ever more complex activities into algebra problems. It doesn't change the fundamental fact that we're dealing with a simulation of human intelligence, not the real thing. So it would remain not human general intelligence.
Right. Would technology be less of a threat if most technologists were Christians and or lived by biblical principles?
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well, I mean, so I think that all depends. Let's go back to my example of the Marxist banker. If the idea is these are the values that you have to at least put on at work to do your job successfully, then it might be that being a Christian makes no difference. Because to do your job successfully, you still have to put on those values. Now, if it meant that who was it who said in the 60s, what if they tried to have a war and no one showed up? Maybe in that sense, if people just reached a point where they weren't interested and they disengaged from social media, they stopped giving away their data, then yeah, maybe then it could make a difference.
I'm immediately thinking of the Apple TV show Severance, in which, have you seen Severance?
I'm afraid, I don't watch TV. So.
There you go. I mean, look at that. How many of you have seen Severance, right? So the idea is that you could surgically have a procedure in which you would sever your work life from your home life. And that the self that lives at home would not be privy to what happens at work and vice versa. So when you're talking about that putting on a different self, it makes me think about that. And really the show is obviously trying to get us to think about what it means to compromise perhaps our most deeply held values when we put on our work clothes and go to work. And
yeah, so you just made all my former students really nervous because I talk about this in some of the classes.
Yeah.
Well, so I think this gets to an issue that's much bigger than even just ethics of technology, but that there is an interesting skill set that people in the modern workforce have. that perhaps people didn't have a few centuries ago. And that is to, in a sense, compartmentalize themselves. And the way I put it is like, it's almost like you're a monk at work, you know, completely under the discipline of an overseer, and then you're a hedonist on the weekends.
Yeah.
But that kind of fragmentation of the self
Yeah.
is in and of itself already a moral problem. There's no consistent, you can't have a consistent character if you routinely divide yourself up in this fashion.
And it's not just two divisions, I would argue. I mean, most modern people are divided in 5, 6, 7 different ways.
Yeah, you're just making it worse. Yeah.
Yeah. How do we as Christians maintain a non-nihilistic approach to a world gravitating towards the magician's final sacrifice? Can we just tell people to be good or to shift political will overnight around AI?
Yeah. So this is a question of, so now you're going to force me to answer what should Christians do? Well, I do think some kind of disengagement is really important. I think one of the best thinkers who's addressed this issue is a guy, he died just recently, Albert Borgman. And he taught at, I believe it's University of Montana. And he said, look, there's two kinds of ways of using tools in the world. There's the modern technological way, where essentially we train ourselves to expect instant gratification. And then there's kind of the older way, where there has to be an investment of attention, activity, and acquisition of skill. And he said we have to pick some of these areas of attentive engagement with the world that he called focal practices and say, hey, these are the ones we're not getting rid of. And we have to anchor our lives in these practices. He did not think we had to completely get rid of technology, but he did think we had to make serious commitments to the activities that are off limits. His examples, we might need more than his, but for example, he's cooking the family meal and the family dinner was one where he thinks we should be very careful about bringing devices into that world. But we're probably going to need more.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm going to throw out my Pac-Man TV trays then. How do your students react to AI in these critiques? Are they still regularly using it?
If I catch them using it, they get in trouble. I teach an ethics and AI class at Baylor. And what I usually tell them is this. I give them a little story about me and my mom. By the time I was doing high school math, calculators were standard in the 90s. My mom, when she was in high school in the 1960s, when she was in trigonometry, they had to use this big reference book with all the sine, cosine, and yeah. Now, you will not be surprised to know that my mom can do math in her head much better than I can. Yeah. Okay? But I'll tell you, I don't feel too bad about that because in my mind, math, doing calculations isn't that central to who I am. However, when it comes to writing, I think it's different. Often I don't know what I think until I actually start trying to write it out. And sometimes I'm surprised. Often I encounter problems that I have to work through and overcome in the process of writing. And really writing perhaps is a good candidate for one of Borgman's focal practices, something we shouldn't let go of, because it's where we actually engage in some of that self-cultivation. If I were to delegate all my writing to a device, one, I would probably start feeling writer's block anytime I had to compose an email. I think it'll start creeping up. So yeah, and usually when they hear that, they take it seriously while they're in class. I don't know after.
Well, we're creatures of habit, right? And so, like you say, I mean, if we get out of the habit of something like that, then it disappears over time. It's also one of the reasons why our bishops are continually reminding us as clergy not to use AI to write our sermons. Which again, to many of us seems like just self-evident. But at the same time, right, we seem to have this recognition that writing a sermon or writing something that is presented to the public in a very sort of serious and intentional way, if you were to fake that or get help with that, that feels really, really wrong, fundamentally wrong. Yeah.
Yeah.
Same
Definitely.
thing with education, though, and writing an essay, as you said.
Yeah, I'm willing to put those on the list of practices we have to
Yeah.
preserve.
Yeah. How do we get people to care about all of this?
Oh boy, wow. I think they'll start caring when AI comes for their jobs. So it may not be the humanities concerns that first get people thinking about AI, but for all my talk about how it's not human general intelligence, it is still a very useful tool. And I remember one time having a conversation with Doug Linnett, and we were talking about some large language model, and it wasn't that great. I was like, oh my gosh, look at this. When you first start reading it, it seems like it makes sense. But if you really look down, it's entirely inconsistent. There's holes in the logic you can drive a truck through. And Doug said, yeah, it's like reading an undergraduate paper. And so AI doesn't have to be as high performing as 99th percentile to displace people from work.
We were talking while we were eating dinner together about this, the way that Erickson talks about this sort of unique capability that we have as human beings of making these inferential leaps. He uses Sherlock Holmes as one of the examples that, predicting the future or thinking outside the box is not something that AI is able to do. How would you best describe what it is that is unique to human intelligence and spirit?
Yeah. So Eric Larson's talking about what he calls abduction. And as a background, we generally classify human reasoning into deductive, which would be like logical reasoning, inductive, which would be probabilistic or statistical, and then abductive rarely gets talked about. And I would suggest one reason it's not really talked about is that you can't do it with a computer, okay? If you read carefully Sherlock Holmes' stories, he actually does very little deduction. He does a ton of abduction. That is, he does what we call inference to the best explanation, okay? So if you were to walk outside and the streets were wet, you might make an educated guess that it had rained. That's actually very different from statistical learning because this allows us to advance knowledge and know things that we haven't directly experienced before. This is how we make scientific breakthroughs. So long as we use AI that is machine learning, which is what 99% of it is, it's always going to be limited by the data it has access to, okay? And even a petabyte of data, it sounds like a lot of data, but the world is always going to be bigger than the data set. And once the AI encounters something that's not in the data, it breaks. They are brittle. So I would not recommend getting into a self-driving car.
Right.
Okay. Or at least don't put it on full self-auto. Right. Because it might be able to do a lot of things pretty well, but what if it has never seen a Cheerios box on a wagon and it accidentally mistakes it for a semi-truck and it swerves and hits you into a tree? There's a famous fatality in Florida where it simply did not recognize a semi-truck and drove into it. Okay? It's not seeing a semi-truck. Want me to just kind of go off on some of this stuff?
Go.
Yeah. When you're training AI to recognize images, the AI is not seeing the images. Remember, those images have to be transformed into some kind of data. And the syntax of that language that the image data is being turned into, those are the limitations of the AI. It cannot see outside of that. So if there is any relevant information that's not captured, when we make that transformation to the data, it's invisible to the
Which
AI.
of these images have sidewalks?
Yeah.
It's why,
Yeah,
right? It's why
that's how
those
we're
are-
training it up. Yeah.
Those are legitimate questions to prove that you're a human.
Right.
Because they seem so simple to us, but it's something that the AI simply
Extremely
can't do.
difficult. And every time you answer that, you're training AI. So if it ever asks you, where would you hide from a robot? Just skip it. Skip to the next one.
We're out of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Reed.
Yeah.
Yeah. This is great.
Thanks for having me.
Please be sure to join us next week. Our diocesan bishop, Andy Doyle, will be joining us for our fourth and final talk of this series. He'll be bringing really all of what we've been talking about to bear on what the church looks like in a world that we've been describing over these past 3 weeks. So we invite you back next week. Thanks again.